Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you may be across our lovely world. Thanks so much for joining us here live again today for Serverless Office Hours. We did have a 1 week break. It was a bit of a quiet week last week. I'm sure we're going to get into that. But yeah, we are streaming on the AWS Twitch channel, on the YouTube Serverless Land channel, and also via LinkedIn Live. This week, I'm super happy to be joined by not one, but two experts in step functions, Denise and Tanya. I was saying we had a bit of a quiet week last week. It was reInvent, if you weren't aware. So, Tanya, welcome to Serverless Office Hours. I feel terrible because this is only the first time you've ever been on Serverless Office Hours, even though you are one of our absolute gurus in the step functions product management thing. So how are you doing? What's your sort of journey to AWS, and how was reInvent last week? That's a lot of questions.
Yeah. No worries. Thanks for having me. You can tell. Maybe I'll start with how was your reInvent last week. It was awesome, and you can tell by sort of the hoarse voice that I have here that many reInvent participants also had, sort of recovering away from the dry air of the desert. So that's nice, and sort of coming over the colds that you always bring back after reInvent. But it was really, really nice to connect with folks. So I'm a principal product manager on the Step Functions team. Super weird that it's been my first time joining you on Serverless Office Hours. We'll have to make sure we change that and make this a bit more of a reoccurring theme. But
fine by
you
me.
Have had, yeah, you have had other product managers on here. So, so I've been on the team for 3 years, or a little over 3 years. I guess I'm coming up on 4. Time flies. And I was actually based out of Vancouver, Canada, with the majority of the team, and then about a year ago made the trek out east. So now I'm based out of Montreal, Canada. But happy to be here.
Cool. Well, and Denise, you're a returning guest. Thanks so much for coming back. So Tanya doesn't need to be too worried that you're not coming back on office hours. So yeah, how was your reInvent, and what's been going on in Denise's life?
Yeah, reInvent was awesome, but I think I echo Tanya's comment, coming back with the reInvent code. Definitely feeling better today, and happy to be back in Vancouver with all the moisture and humidity. Lots of rain here, so it's awesome. So I am a senior product manager on the Step Functions team, and I've been with the team for almost a year and a half now, and joined the team because Tanya had great things to say about this team and AWS in general. I'm super happy to be here again.
Cool. Excellent. Well, yeah, I think we've all picked up the logo. We were all talking beforehand how, you land up picking something from reInvent. Normally, I'm pretty resilient, but yeah, this year I also brought some things back. But I actually a comment. I'm living in London. It was also cold and raining yesterday. And just walking outside, you could just breathe in, and it was like, oh, moisture, humidity. Normally, that's miserable. It was just skin, everything. Cool. Well, before we get onto step function stuff, let's just look over the past weeks or so of what's been going on. Quite a few things. The previous stream was actually 2 weeks ago, and that was pre-invent. And we had literally a cast, a crew of, it seemed to be many people talking all about things reInvent. We did go into a whole bunch of releases that were related to that had been coming up in the pre-invent kind of season, and a lot of info and talks and everything to do with reInvent. So that's, along with all other Service Office Hours episodes, is on our youtube.com/serviceland page. Plenty of cool stuff over there. Just looking at some of the other services, even though we're focusing on step functions today, Lambda had their big Lambda function scaling come out. So that means Lambda functions can now scale by 1,000 concurrent invokes every 10 seconds. So it's every function. It's no longer shared, and that is every region. Yeah, I can't think anything that there would be caveats to say about that. Yeah, just much simpler scaling. So that's super cool over that. And then some of the other ones are pre-invent announcements. Many more runtimes. We're getting much quicker with the runtimes coming out, and lots of things to do with Lambda function logs. On EventBridge's sort of key cool thing is how it integrates with other things, not just AWS. So they're now new partner integrations with Adobe and Stripe. So if you are using anything Adobe related or Stripe related, now it's much easier to get those events on your event bus, and also send results of whatever your event bus is doing out to those partners as well. And in terms of SNS and SQS, FIFO topics just gets super crazy fast. SQS FIFO also got a high throughput mode. I think it was now forgetting me, it's something like 7,000 a second, or maybe it's 70, I don't know. It's a lot, basically. So SNS and SQS doing a lot of things that are correlating to make sure that you can build high throughput applications using those services. if you're thinking of Amplify and AppSync, what's new? Yeah, Amplify had a whole next generation of backend building capabilities, they're calling it. It's pretty much the V2 of Amplify. So a whole bunch of things over there, and also including JavaScript 6 general availability. And then AppSync also has some new monitoring of real-time GraphQL subscriptions. Amazon S3 had a whole bunch of things, a new S3 Express One Zone high performance storage class. So that's S3 all in one zone, super low latency, some mount points, a whole bunch of stuff for S3. Of course, when you're building serverless applications, S3 is often a critical part of that. It's a bit of a breath, but step functions. So reInvent was actually super busy for the step functions team, and we've got sort of some releases that came out with it. Who wants to take the top one, the restarting workflows from failure?
I can take that one. So we can consider it a reInvent or a pre-invent launch. We slipped in right before, I guess, officially reInvent kicks off. This one here is pretty big. I think this was our top customer request. Many of you probably watching had either reached out to me sort of via socials, or maybe we met in person to discuss this. And this is the ability to restart your workflow from its point of failure. And I'll show you what this looks like. But if you can imagine you're building these complex workflows, and all of a sudden you're at step 8 of 10 and something fails. Previously, it's quite painful and sort of time consuming for you to have to kick off and go to this first step again and rerun that workflow. And Julian, you can imagine, like, depending on the services, it might be either costly from a service perspective, but also time. If one of those services takes an hour, you have to wait another hour. So this feature really addresses that, where now you can just kick off and restart your workflow from wherever it failed using the same input. And I'll provide a bit of context here. This one I think is super helpful, and at reInvent it connected with quite a few folks who are telling me about how this has been useful in their production workloads right now. So something, downstream service isn't coming back right away. There's an issue, some manual interventions required, or there's a period of time where there's a disruption. So their error handling or their automatic retries didn't work, and now this really gets them going without having to do any additional lift or rerun their workflows. That was number one.
Yeah, Tanya will be showing us what that looks like shortly, but then optimized integrations for Amazon Bedrock. That sounds like an interesting one.
Yeah, so next one I'll take this. So the, everyone's talking about generative AI and sort of thinking about how it can be implemented in their existing applications. How do I take advantage of some of these foundation models? And Bedrock is sort of Amazon's entry point for accessing many foundation models that are hosted. So it's a serverless service. It scales for you and provides sort of the gateway. And what we found were there are a lot of customers saying, I'd like to take advantage of this, but I'd like to do this within the context of my own application or while using my other services. So these optimized integrations we'll take a look at provide an easy way for you to do that within the context of your workflow. So you get all those like great capabilities that Step Functions provides, so things like native error handling, the visualization, state management, etc.
Yeah, so obviously Step Functions can integrate with every AWS service just via the SDK. What is sort of the optimized integration add in addition to that?
So the optimized integration. So you can think of an optimized integration as additional capabilities that we've provided to certain API actions or certain API actions from AWS services. So an example that's probably well known is Lambda. So the Lambda invoke API, we have an optimized integration with that API where Lambda's API output returns as escape JSON. And we'll actually automatically transform that into a JSON object, so easier passing to subsequent steps in your workflow. That would be an example of sort of one optimized integration. Others might be the way that we actually call that service. So for example, if it's an asynchronous API, we'll actually create a wrapper, and it basically turns it into a synchronous API where we will get the response back from that API before moving on to the next step in your workflow. And most people refer to this as the .sync integration because you append .sync to the end of the API action. So those are some of the examples, sort of optimized integrations.
Cool, excellent. And then yes, HTTPS endpoints and a new TestState API. Exciting.
Yeah. This is actually we're pretty proud of these integrations. This is something that customers had asked for Step Functions to introduce as well. We'll start with the HTTP endpoints because I think they are sort of two launches sort of tucked into one, if you will. And we'll see why we chose to do that. But HTTP endpoints now gives you the ability to directly invoke virtually any SaaS or public endpoint from your workflow. So you can think of like previously you might have had to use a Lambda function to do that, and then you'd have to write your auth and all of that inside your Lambda function and manage that. Customers told us, you know what, that's great, but I would much rather just do it directly from my workflow, and you take care of the auth for me. Give me all the stuff I like about Step Functions, and then also in Express workflows, for example, make that because they're low latency workflows. You know, the latency there is quite nice as well. So we introduced the ability for you to call any public endpoint as part of your workflow. And
Simple as
then, yeah, it's as simple as that.
As a mental model, is this similar to EventBridge API destinations where you can call any API?
Yeah, that's a great comparison. So exactly like that. And even I'll go so far as API destinations and EventBridge has something called a connection, which is how you provide authentication to that endpoint or to that SaaS provider. We've actually gone ahead and reused that same connection as part of the authentication to sort of a public endpoint as well. So you can now sort of use that connection if you're connecting to, let's say, Stripe, and it's the same endpoint as part of your Step Functions workflow. You can reuse that connection as well as part of the workflow. It's a great comparison for those that are familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke a lot at reInvent about how Step Functions and EventBridge may be different services, but they work extremely well together, and you can use them for different use cases. And combining them together, and even better now that some of your connector resources in EventBridge are just reusable as they are in Step Functions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where you get the power of AWS is combining events sort of from EventBridge and using Step Functions with the workflows. And then when you're moving across services, you might actually need a sequence of events or a sequence of steps that take place. That's where Step Functions really excels. And then maybe to help you with that, I'll just cover off the test API. Again, a highly requested feature. It's not easy to test distributed applications and to test those in a way that you can sort of see what's happening very quickly. With Step Functions, that was also true in that it wasn't easy to test a single step or a single state of your workflow without having to run the whole thing or sort of manage that outside. So we've introduced a new TestState API. It's available both in the console and programmatically, and it allows you to invoke that single state. So whatever it is, whether it's a public endpoint or whether it's an AWS service or whether it's a past state. And what you'll see is, hey, did my connection work? Did my auth on that service work? Did I connect properly? As I move the data through the input and output processing, the manipulation of data, did that turn out as I expected? Is there an issue with how that moves? And then quickly address that. And then on the public endpoint or the HTTP endpoint, we also provide the raw request and response information. So you can see, is there something, when you're connecting to public endpoints, you're never quite sure what's going to be in the header. Is there something different? It's kind of, so that third ability to be able to actually validate and see what's there is super helpful as you're testing and building.
Cool. Excellent. Thanks, Tanya. And then, Workflow Studio integration with VS Code. I know this is bundled in with a whole bunch of things to do with application composers. So, Denise, tell us about this.
Yeah, you got it. So many of our customers use Workflow Studio to build and design their workflow. So for those that haven't used it, Workflow Studio is a visual tool. You drag and drop steps or states into your workflow, and it is a visual representation of the Amazon States language. So that's our domain-specific language for Step Function workflows. Customers love it. They talk about how quickly it is to prototype their workflows, to design their workflows, all in our console. But before reInvent, in order to move these workflows to infrastructure as code, there were a bunch of manual steps that customers had to go through. Now, when you're working with infrastructure as code, especially with serverless, you may have a lot of different services in your application alongside your state machine or your step function workflow. So that's where Application Composer came into play. What we've done is we've collaborated collaborated with the Application Composer team. We've added Workflow Studio into the Application Composer experience. So you can compose your serverless application by dragging and dropping different resources into Application Composer. And if you have a workflow in there, you can zoom into it, open up Workflow Studio and start designing it, and it works directly in your infrastructure as code. What's really cool about this integration is Application Composer also launched their VS Code toolkit extension during reInvent. So that means Workflow Studio is now also available in VS Code through this integration.
Yeah, 2 for 1. I love it that it's sort of not even snuck in there. It's just like, oh yes, we've got an IDE extension for Workflow Studio. Oh, and that also means the Step Functions is also available in the IDE. That is super cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, often when I speak to people or do presentations, obviously we talk about using the consoles, one way to use AWS. And I've always said before that I think we could have been honest in the past that AWS wasn't necessarily the best graphical designers for coming up with these awesome console experiences, because it is so hard and there's so many different services. And then Step Functions literally raised the bar and knocked it out the park with the whole Workflow Studio. And, this became the super important way to visually build applications. And now with Workflow Studio and this whole integration, I love the story that you can actually now build in the console without feeling as though you're getting further and further behind, by knowing that best practices as infrastructure as code. I know I should be doing that, but maybe that's a little bit hard. And so I'm sort of caught in this kind of thing. And so I love this sort of circular thing that we've come up with, that you can actually build in the console, export it to infrastructure as code, and in fact now even do it just in your local IDE, which is not even in the console. It's sort of having the console in your IDE for this particular workflow. So,
it's exactly that console experience in your IDE. There's no exporting required, reads directly from your local file. So
fantastic. Well, just to shout out that we obviously joined by one of our Step Functions team members in a way. Ben Smith's on our team. Hello, Ben. Welcome back from reInvent. Hopefully you haven't got the lurgy as well. But yeah, just as Ben's comment came in, Alpa Codes. And Alpa Codes actually met Alpa Codes at reInvent. So long-time service office hours attendees will recognize Alpa Codes, often sends us comments and suggestions and cool things. So to meet Alpa Codes in person, that was super cool. Thanks for coming. And then he's obviously just mentioned that Ben Smith, you must use, for when using redrive, you do need to use the same Step Functions definition payload to use redrive. That's one of it. You're redriving it rather than redoing it. Maybe that's a bad analogy. Yeah, thanks Alpa Codes, and it was cool to meet you. And then Diego Santiago from YouTube, thanks for joining us. This was interesting. I didn't quite pick up on this, but EventBridge apparently also limits a request up to 5 seconds, and Step Function supports up to 60 seconds. I think this is what was for the HTTPS endpoints.
You got it. Yeah. And Diego's actually an engineer, a principal engineer from the Step Functions team. So happy to have him here too.
Cool, Diego. Thanks for joining us. I was like, wow, some people are fully into the nuts and bolts of the details, but Diego is making the details. So that is super cool. And then, in terms of Jay Shah, thanks for joining us. Also, our YouTube, do you have IntelliJ integration? I don't believe so yet, but
not yet. Not yet.
Hopefully it's on somebody's Christmas card list. I don't think necessarily for this Christmas, but yeah, sometime. Well, just as you realized, obviously we are live on Serverless Office Hours, so we'd love to, tell us your questions and your comments. Tell us where you're from. If you're at reInvent, what you enjoyed about it, or what you took away from reInvent. That would all be super cool. So I think we've been through the what's new in terms of the high view. So how do we? Who wants to show what first? This doesn't have to be a Squid Game fighting thing. We can just pick one.
Yeah, maybe well, I have two. So maybe I can start with HTTP endpoints, and I'll sort of do that and redrive at the same time, and then Denise can go through App Composer. Yeah, exactly, and then flip back and forth.
Sounds good to me. See, this is where the Step Functions team is all organized. It's all a workflow. There's rollback things. They've already got thinking in the background. This is how it works.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a bad analogy. I'm sorry. Coming back from reInvent.
Oh, you know what? Everyone I think right now is recovering and getting stood up again, and sort of either preparing for the holiday season or recovering from the reInvent.
One or the other.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll sort of, I think most people are familiar with Step Functions, but it's a workflow service that basically allows you to create workflows. It's serverless, so you only pay for what you use. It automatically scales. And what I want to show you before I sort of like dive into an actual example that works is we've got these nice little templates. Denise actually was the product manager who worked on this, that can help you get going. So if there's, something you like to do that's more frequent, or things that we hear from customers that comes up often, we've sort of created a template that you can actually deploy and run and then build on it, to get started. And right off the bat, you'll see that we have this generate invoices using Stripe. And this is taking advantage of that HTTP endpoint launch that we announced at reInvent. And we also have this Bedrock integration. So I'll show you both of those projects. But of course, before I do, I'm going to take you into sort of like, what would this look like if you had a blank canvas? And this is Workflow Studio. And Julian's very familiar with this. It's our visual building experience. And Ben did some great talks and sort of walked customers through this as well at reInvent, where, it's a drag and drop interface. So you'll notice that I've got this HTTP endpoint, this new task that you can simply drag onto the canvas. Interesting. Yeah, there we go. You can see the canvas right now?
No,
not quite yet. We've just still got your 3-state machines.
Yeah.
Weird. It didn't. Maybe I'll just refresh here. Your screen is very different than my screen.
Oh, maybe an unshare and a reshare.
Yeah.
Are you maybe sharing a
looks
tab
like
or something?
I only have one tab. Let me reshare.
Gremlins.
It looks like we froze on the original. Let me.
Proving we are live. You can see not all perfect demos.
There. Now you see. Okay.
Yes.
So we're back to where I was. Great. So you'll see this. Well, I'll just start from here, but you'll see this drag and drop visual interface where you drag this. Oh, it's not updating, hey? Interesting. Here, let me, it freezes on the screen. It doesn't actually allow me to update it.
That is haven't come across that one before.
Yeah. Denise, do you want to try to share and see if you can move around while I figure this one out? We'll switch to App Composer.
Yeah, we'll switch. Okay, let's see. So what I'm going to show is the application composer experience inside VS Code. This might look strange to people because it is in light mode. I think many of you all use dark mode in VS Code, but I prefer my light mode. So here we are. What I'm showing here is one of my demo projects here. And I'll quickly show how we can open up Workflow Studio. So what you can see is if you right click on your template, you can actually click open in open an application composer. So this is a SAM project. It's got a template, it's got some Lambda functions, and it's got a couple of state machines here. So I'll click on my YAML file here for my template, and I will open this in Application Composer. So there's also a shortcut right up here in the top corner. And if I didn't mention already, this is all available in the AWS toolkit. So by clicking on that, you can see how much easier it was to visualize it versus looking at this line of code. There's many, many lines of codes in here. I can see there's some queues, there's a dead letter queue, there's some topics. I could, go into each line and try to visualize this in my head. But I think what's really great about Application Composer is you don't have to do that. You click it and you can really see your architecture and how everything is connected, all visually. So here you see, this is the Application Composer canvas. And if you have a state machine, so let's take, for example, this state machine or workflow called the parent state machine, you'll see this new button to edit in Workflow Studio. And you'll see a sample of the definition for the workflow in the configuration panel. And you can also see, if I jump in here, that the definition for this is actually in an external JSON file. So I have a separate file for my ASL. So that's, again, the workflow definition for my parent state machine here. You can see it all here. Again, sort of easy to read, maybe not for some. So what you can do is when you click in here and you go to Edit in Workflow Studio, you can see our Step Functions Workflow Studio all available here. So it looks like Workflow Studio and everything seems to be working properly on my view, right? So right here, you can easily build and update this workflow directly using Workflow Studio. So if I just do a quick example here, maybe I want to add some extra steps. Perhaps we'll add another SNS step. It's very simple interface, so you can drag and drop your steps into your workflow. You can click into it to configure it. So for this topic, let's assume before I start my workflow, I want to publish to a new topic that the workflow is getting started. I can do that simply by dragging that SNS publish step, and I can configure it on this right-hand panel. We call it the inspector. And what you see here is in this integration, we allow you to add what we call CloudFormation definition substitutions. So this is a feature of our state machine resource in CloudFormation that allows you to use parameters or variables for your resources. So previously, if you're used to using Workflow Studio in a console, you had to type in a hard-coded ARN or choose a resource at runtime. Here, you're able to put in a variable, so it's defined during deployment time. So I'll use that feature here. And we'll call this my new topic. I can save that. And what you can see is the step gets added directly into my JSON file here. So this is one of my local files. It's all added. So I'll return to Application Composer. You can see the step has also been added here. So now how do I connect this to a new topic that I want to add to my application? Well, this is where the Application Composer canvas comes in handy. You can just simply drag and drop a topic onto my canvas, and you can see in the templates, it should be added directly in here. Where did it get added?
I think this exactly makes the point of hunting
there
through 192 lines.
I couldn't even find it. It was off to make that point. It is hard to find things in your template. So there you go. The auto started topic has been added to our template. And if I click, or if I drag this line here, maybe it didn't like my font. I may have to edit this again. Again, live demos, folks. We'll have to get that checked out. But if I put that without it, it should work. It should like that better, yeah. So you can see what's happened is it's updated my definition substitution that I used and linked it to the reference for the started topic. What it's also done is it's added the permission policy for my state machine. So both of them have been added with just that single drag and drop of a line. So we offer this capability to connect resources in such a way if they're what we call optimized integrations and an enhanced component on the application composer side. But I think quickly walk through what the experience might look like if we're using standard resources on the application composer side. And for those that aren't aware, application composer, I want to say earlier this year, did launch support for all CloudFormation resources. So they come as standard resources. So you can add something like, let's just use this for now. Don't know why this might need to be, but it comes with, it's a CloudFormation resources. It comes with some of the configurations that you might need, but you do have to manually enter it. And they also launched Code Whisperer integration at reInvent. So you can have Code Whisperer generate some suggestions for you for these standard resources. But if I go into my workflow studio here and edit it, we can show an example of adding a step where we try to connect this new put event with, I won't do anything fancy. We'll try to do this with, we'll try to add this to a new bus here. So if I add an event bus, again, this is a standard component. It's not an easy drag and drop or drawing of a line, can't connect that. So what you can do is go into the configuration panel, open up the configuration panel, scroll down to the event bus name, and it will autocomplete so you can quickly select it and make the connection as well. So we've supported both ways. There's a very easy connection experience for our optimized integrations and enhanced resources on the application composer canvas. For everything else, you can simply use the autocomplete to make those connections.
And also, when the canvas does get a little bit crazy and messy, you can also reorganize it. So
I made it very messy there. So yes, there you go. All nice and connected now. And again, that everything is updated here, and Application Composer offers the sync button. I won't press it because I know I didn't fully configure all my resources during the demo, but if you click sync, it will deploy directly to the account you've configured it on.
Okay. Yeah, Denise, we did have some just some questions about the plugins, and is it working with CDK or only SAM projects?
SAM and CloudFormation only at this time.
Yeah, and in fact, yeah, Daniel Menendez, thanks for joining us as well. Will this be able to use the CDK? Not quite yet, but in a way, there are only CloudFormation resources under the scenes, and that's also what CDK is using. So, you know, hopefully in the future, that may be done a little bit easier.
Yeah, but you know what? This is all great, great feedback that we can take back to the team for sure.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, that's great. We haven't even launched AWS console. Everything's local. Everything's syncing. You can deploy directly from here. Yeah, that's great.
You got it. And if you are using, oh, did that switch? Maybe. If you are using the console, because I think there was a question about IntelliJ support, there is local sync capability in the console. So you get a similar experience where you can sync to your local files and, you know, make it work with your existing development flows in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so you won't actually see the canvas in your local IDE if you're not using VS Code, but because the files, I mean, they are just text files, are synced locally. If you are using some other text editor, you'll be able to have the files syncing to your local machine, just not the visual canvas. So there is support.
Yeah.
And actually, Rai, yeah, good point from Rai. Thanks for joining us. SAM and CloudFormation supported today, but share feedback through the console, which the team reads. So yeah, in fact, that's any feedback against any service. Yeah, send it via the console or via ourselves as well, and we'll be happy to pass it on. So, Tanya, are we crossing fingers and toes and maybe getting some updating in the
we're going to try again. I think we got it. So we'll see.
Let's redrive the demo.
Yeah, let's redrive. Yeah, there we go. So these are the templates I was talking about. Oh, you couldn't see, but I will spend a bunch of time. You do have this new template here to get started using Stripe. We'll talk about this shortly. And we've also got a sample project, a template here that gets you started with Amazon Bedrock as well. What I will start with is the blank canvas, which drops you into Workflow Studio. And that's our visual design experience, where you can sort of simply drag and drop the services or resources that you want to use from the left-hand side, pop them into the canvas. So what you'll notice right now is I've just dropped in an HTTP endpoint, which is calling a public service. So this is the integration that we launched at reInvent. It is sort of a generic integration in that you won't actually find the SaaS partners on the left-hand side that you'd want to use and drop in. But you can, of course, configure them on the right-hand side. So you'd be able to sort of name it whatever you want. My first SaaS service. You'll be able to put in sort of exactly what you would expect with respect to an HTTP endpoint. So your what endpoint do you want to hit, including the path. You'd be able to specify that here. You got your method, so your get, post, put, delete, patch, options, head. Basically, just about every method you can imagine would be supported. And then Julian alluded to how API destinations is similar to HTTP endpoints. However, we've got sort of that 1 minute timeout on the HTTP task, but we use that same connection, that idea of a connection ARN or a connection resource to specify your authentication. There's a couple reasons why we chose to do this. One of which is we do not want to put our secret information inside our state machine definition. Because if you do that, that could end up in sort of logs or your execution history where someone that you might not want to see that could have access and view that. So instead, we have a connection ARN. And that connection ARN is simply the resource that you're using. You can choose your auth. So a connection supports API key, basic, auth, and OAuth. You specify those details in the EventBridge console as part of that connection flow. You create your connection and then just take that ARN and you reference it as part of the parameters. And then you've got things like your standard request body. You can dive in a little bit deeper and provide additional headers if you want, query parameters. And we've also got this neat sort of transform ability or encode decode ability, which was for APIs that might not necessarily expect to receive JSON. So we discovered this as part of some of the user research that we were doing. We were using a Stripe API, fairly common API. And we found that as customers were trying to call that API, that API actually expected form URL encoding to be done on sort of the data that's being provided. And that was a bit painful as for the developer to figure out how to do that and what's the format. So we've provided this ability where you simply check it, and I'll show you what this looks like shortly, and then you can choose how you want to encode it, from JSON to form encoded using indices, brackets, repeat, commas, and that's because each provider that you're hitting, or that endpoint provider, often expects a different type of encoding. So this provides you the ability to choose what the provider expects, and then sort of build your workflow that way. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to jump into a workflow that's fully built out, and we can see what that looks like. And this is, we'll show you the state, sort of the visual first. So I'll zoom right in here. I'm going to delete this. I'll show you this shortly, but. All right. So this is an invoice flow, which what it does is it basically, it has a list customers API, and it calls the Stripe API to say, give me a list of customers. And this is really great API because it's got a whole bunch of test data available for you. So you don't need an account. You can go ahead and play with this to sort of figure out how it works. So you can list a whole bunch of customers. Then we're going to go use that. We're going to take a map state and see, do they have payment data? Do they have sort of the credit card information for the invoices or not? So we're going to get their payment method. If there's a credit card missing, we're going to have them go down one flow. If they have a credit card, then we're going to check the expiration date to say, hey, is it expired or is it a valid card? And then based on that, we're going to have them go down to this second flow. So it's a bit more of an involved workflow as opposed to a one-step. We're going to summarize all that, and we're going to have each group, so the expired, valid, or missing credit card information, flow down its own little branch. And that might be because maybe there's no credit card information, and we're actually going to later collect all those customers' missing credit card information and send them an email or follow up some other way. And if they do actually have their credit card information, then we're going to create an invoice. And you can see when you actually create the invoice, it's a post. We've got a connection ARN that's specified, so this uses the API key from Stripe. And what you'll notice is that we've got our advanced parameters. We've got the ability to apply that URL encoding. So that takes the JSON and transforms it into a URL encoded payload. And of course, you can now update the content type to say, hey, we've got a not application / JSON, but we've actually got application / form URL encoded data that we're going to be providing. So it that endpoint will actually accept it. And if we kick over here, and you can, this is all in Workflow Studio, so you can not only configure it using those the configuration panel on the right, but you can also look at the whole workflow definition here. And what you'll see, for exact on this create invoice API, you'll see it's the task. It's this new HTTP invoke. So that's the new task we're using. It's got the endpoint details that we've provided. The method is a post. We've got the connection ARN that we're using that has the auth details for that Stripe API. And this is publicly documented. They have an API key that you can go out and test out if you want to play with this yourself. Got the headers that we've chosen to include, the request body that's popping through from listing the customers and then seeing if they have payment detail. And then this is the block that I was just referencing, that transformability, which allows you to say, I'd like you to change the body to URL encoded, and I want you to do this format for that specific one. So this time we just support URL encoded. I fully expect customers to say, hey, I want to connect with other APIs. Can you do things like XML? Would you support that? So as you have feedback or you want more and more support, please let Julian, let us know. We're always looking around on social. The artist formerly known as Twitter, we'll look on there and see what you're posting as well. The other benefit, from step functions that you often hear from customers is the ability to natively provide error handling. Gives you that resiliency. So you can specify things like your retry, your back off, your max number of attempts, and then introduce jitter. So there's sort of random intervals between when you retry. The same is true for this HTTP task. So all of that continues to apply as part of this. And we've also got this status code. So you can actually choose to retry based on specific status codes of your endpoint. Now, but Tanya, does it work? We'll execute this workflow. So we're going to run it. And because the first step is a list customers, I don't need to pay. I don't need to provide any input. I still have, there we go. I forgot to save it. There we go. Now we'll execute it. Live demo. It's got a list as the first step. So again, you see this visual experience where the workflow moves as it progresses. So you'll see that it lists the customers, this section's complete, and then it moves into sort of whether there's an expired credit card, and then these two flows are also in progress. If I click on any state here, you could, we'll fix that, don't worry. You'll ultimately see the input and the output that's passed as well. So you'll be able to click on a specific state and you'll be able to say, what was the input into that specific step? What was the output? So these were the headers, the content length. The input for this was a valid credit card. That's great. And the customer ID that was here. Now, if I actually wanted to look at this and say, well, does this work before I'm actually running my entire workflow? That's actually where you can run this TestState API, which is one of the launches that I referenced. So if I click on, let's say, this Create Invoices API, in the console, you'll notice TestState. This is also available programmatically, so you can run that way. And you would simply provide whatever input you want. I just copied the input that was successful that time to see if it works. It said card status, it's got a customer ID, and then you'll notice this inspection level. And this is where you can choose how much information you want back, where info is sort of the default level, which just says, hey, is this successful or not? And I can start that test. And then you'll see exactly what was the output based on this card status and this customer ID. So this is the response that comes out from that API request, that output. Now, maybe I need more information. Maybe I've decided to remove some of the input or, pare down what's actually flowing through that specific state. And you can choose debug. So that returns the info level that we just saw, plus details around the input-output processing. I can say start test. And then if I actually move from output tab and I click input-output processing, you'll see fields related to after the input path. What does that data look like? So after I've removed some things, after parameters field. So you can actually see how the data flows through the state and make adjustments accordingly. If you wanted to see things like the HTTP request, you can notice it's not clickable yet until I go one level deeper. So you're sort of going deeper as you want to inspect more, and then you can say start test. And then I can click over to the HTTP request, and you'll see is the raw request and response, so the headers and everything that's included are also now available. So we can go through the response, we'll see the headers. Again, similar information. Again, and the headers from the response on its way back. Let's say you have an auth issue when you're trying to hit that endpoint. You don't want to reveal your secrets, but you do have the ability also to say something like, if you provide your workflow with the permissions to reveal the secrets, which would actually then provide, and you'll see this, if I start this test, will then provide what is the headers for my specific authentication. Where did I go? So you'd be able to actually dive in and see am I missing? Where did I see it?
Would it come from the output or?
Oh, there you go.
Request and response.
Thank you. I should be over here. Just thinking. There we go. Exactly. There you go. So what you'll start to see is the whole, excuse me. You'll see all the headers, and you'll start to dive in and see information pertinent to the auth, which I actually believe is, there we go, the author. Yeah. So you can see that it's an API key or basic auth, sort of what was the token that was provided. So if I, make a mistake with my finger, copying and pasting that over into when I'm creating the connection, you can actually validate that as part of here too. So it's not a black box. You can figure out what's going on. And that's only if you provide those permissions. So
yeah,
this
just
is
to highlight the.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
You've built a pretty decent size application over here, which is going to go to Stripe, get a whole bunch of customer accounts, iterate through each one of them, do 2 sort of checks, does something exist? If not, and this has all been written with no Lambda function code. Now, some people look at that and go, well, that's still a lot of configuration code, but you're not having to do any of the retries. When you talked about the backoff and the jitter, that's just built into the service for you. You're not having to update any runtimes. You're not getting your Dependabot alerts, even though they're so super helpful for all third-party libraries that are going to be then connecting to this API. So you've got a pretty full functioning application written all in step functions. It's not no code, but it's very low code in terms of functional programming, and all those retries, all this debugging and error handling and everything just built into the service. And once you deploy this, if the Stripe API never changes, you never need to amend your app. It's just going to sit there and work sort of forever. That's impressive. So for people who sort of maybe scratching their heads and thinking, step functions for me, this is a really good use case just to show how, you can build some pretty complex workflows, some pretty complex mini applications, all built in step functions.
Yeah. And, if you want to add something to it, it's quite simple to just drag and drop and add or continue to build upon your service.
Yeah, and Daniel Mendez says love it. And I went, Ben Smith, he always talks about step functions first. And this is an interesting thing when people thinking about building applications. A lot of building applications is using SDK calls or some kind of workflow. And Ben's whole thing is to think about that. Could step functions do it? And if step functions can't do it, then you start thinking about Lambda functions. But yeah, literally step functions first as a process for doing anything specifically within SDK. Because if you have an application that's only using the AWS SDK, step functions has got you back. And then if you've got any general workflows, and now with being able to connect to any HTTPS endpoint, step functions can be a lot of your applications. And of course, you can use Lambda functions for anything complex within that, anything more. Step functions and Lambda obviously work super well together.
Yeah, exactly. And so that test state applies to whether you're working with a Lambda function or an HTTP endpoint or a pass state. Now, I mentioned we also had a Bedrock integration. So I will also show you what that looks like. And you can see them on the left-hand side here. I'm just sort of in a blank canvas. I just type in the service name, or, if I knew the API name, I could type that in as well, and it'll appear here on the left-hand side. We've got Amazon Bedrock invoke model. And the invoke model API is the one that you're likely going to interface with when you want to call a foundation model. And then on the right-hand side, the configuration panel pops out. So we've got foundation models. If you've done something like you've added some fine tuning and augmented a model and then made that available, you can choose provision models. But, if you're just using a base model that's readily available within Bedrock, you can just choose foundation model. And then you'll see immediately it gives you a whole list of all the different models that Bedrock has made available as part of this integration. So Cohere, Anthropic, Titan models. You will also notice, for those that are familiar with some of the foundation models available, there's also Stable Diffusion. And Stable Diffusion isn't a large language model, that's an image model. So it can take text and then create images. Now, that's a bit interesting in terms of a workflow.
It's not JSON.
Yeah, it's not JSON, exactly. So what do you do with that? And when I was referencing an optimized integration, these are the things that step functions will build for you. So we provide the ability for you to do things like to reference an S3 bucket. So you can, specify an output. Instead of passing that to the next step, you can actually say, you know what, I want you to put that image in S3 instead of passing it through your workflow. So for images, that's great. But it's also sort of, you can imagine if you're using a foundation model to do something like, here's 20,000 lines of text. I want you to summarize that. And maybe that's too big for the payload limit of 256 kilobytes for step functions. So you can actually, reference an S3 bucket as input for large amounts of data, have the foundation model do something on it, and then write that back to S3. It's a very similar concept to what we've done with distributed map, for those of you familiar with that, where that large amount of payload doesn't actually need to flow through your workflow or your state machine. It can actually just live in S3. We'll point sort of Bedrock invoke model to use that, and then write the outputs and continue on. So let's say I were to sort of take an example here. Let's use Cohere. I simply click Cohere. We'll see the prompt. Now I can put the prompt here. I can hard code the prompt if I wanted, but I could also do something like pass it dynamically into my workflow at runtime. So if I wanted to do that, I could simply do sort of $, and then sorry about that, prompt. Maybe my max tokens, which is basically how big do you want that response to be? And you can roughly think, I think it's around 6 characters or so is considered a token. Is a good rough estimate if you're trying to figure out the size. So let's say it's 100 is my max tokens. And then you can decide to either pass it through or do something else. If I were to take this prompt now, I can create this workflow. But just given we don't have much time, I'm actually just going to say, let's just give it a prompt, and I'm going to show you one that runs fully. Tell me a joke. And the thing about these foundation models is you're never quite sure whether it'll what will happen, right? When you run it against a foundation model, and oftentimes,
Non-deterministic.
yeah, exactly. And oftentimes what you might actually want to do is go ahead and validate the outputs of multiple different foundation models. And you can do that. So you can run a parallel state. You can run multiple different foundation models in parallel, see what the outputs are. And at reInvent, Uma and I actually did Uma's an essay. We did a session on this where you can actually sort of run these different models and see which output do you like better, and then make a decision to proceed with that one. So you can introduce humans as part of these workflows as well. So if you see this is a simple one where it's running. It was a bit slower, this specific model this morning. So it's still in progress. But you know that it's in progress. We can see it's tell me a joke.
And it's
if I were to, yeah, so it's still running. There's no error. It's still going. If I were to actually pop over here, I can see, this is probably a similar one I think I ran right when we were about to join the call, where it's got, tell me a bunch of jokes. And it's jokes can be found in all sorts of contexts. Here are a few jokes that may bring a smile to your face. Why was the math book sad? Because it had too many problems. You can start to see things like this, and we're using a joke, but imagine things like passing in, document processing, or things like serverless video, like create a title and a description for this video, and then be able to hand that over to the next step to then create sort of cover image for this. It can start to become quite powerful.
I mean, we actually used this live at reInvent. We had a sort of live streaming service called Serverless Video, and we actually got someone recorded a video. We took a transcript of the video and then sent it to Amazon Bedrock and said generate a title. And we were actually all running via step functions, and we were actually so pleasantly surprised at how good the titles were, because it wasn't necessarily grabbing word for word what had been said, but would infer from all the text what was been spoken about, and yeah, it was actually quite impressive.
It is. And I think it really depends on the model you choose.
Yeah.
Some are better than others, so you'll have to play with that and sort of figure it out as you go. The last thing I just wanted to sort of share here was I have a Lambda function here that fails half the time, so it's random. But let's say we had something there. We'll see, I should have probably upped the percentage. Let's say we kick off this workflow, and ideally it fails. And it fails because I don't have authorization. So this is a good example though. So if you don't have authorization, you got a cause because it doesn't have the identity policy. So these are these types of workflows where all of a sudden you would be able to recover and redrive your workflow from its point of failure. So you can see redrive from failure. You'd be able to go add permissions, or let's say there was an issue in your function, fix that, and then redrive, and it would kick off exactly that failed step. I know we're at time because of some of my computer issues, so I don't want to.
No, I appreciate that. I think we can get the idea that it's really quick to just be able to do that. Well, everybody, that is amazing. I love the new step functions, things that have been going on. So much cool stuff. Congrats to all the step functions team. And Tanya and Denise, thanks so much for spending time with us on Serverless Office Hours. Tanya, of course, you're always welcome back. And Denise, of course. Really appreciate the demos. And thank you so much. And next week, we've actually got a slightly different Serverless Office Hours. We're going to be part of a 4-day event talking all about serverless things at reInvent. It's going to be live coding. It's going to be utter chaos. It's going to be fun. It's just what it is. So thanks so much for joining us. See you same time, same place next week, but it's all going to be kind of different, if that makes any sense. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.